comes to ageing, it's not how old you are, but how you are old that matters. So how do you keep living life your way when it makes sense to access services that can make a difference? Brought to you by Uniting AgeWell, the Ageing Ideal aims to start conversations to cut through the noise and provide people with a greater understanding of this important chapter of life.
The thing that's remained with me, and not nearly as much now as it was, I've got past the guilt of putting John into care, but I get angry sometimes. Not at him, not at anybody in particular, but just what's happened, because I keep thinking, why him?
In this episode, I'm exploring the connection between carers and their well-being. For so many, the role of caring for an ageing loved one is not one they've trained for, but rather one they find themselves in. So what does that look like, and how can carers and carers-to-be prepare for it instead of encountering it? And what can they do when the going gets tough? Lyn Hamilton is 84 and has cared for her husband John, now 89, since dementia crept into their lives. You'll hear about Lyn's relationship with John, her journey as his carer, and their transition to aged care. Lyn and John's story is not isolated by any means and is there to help provide insight and support for people going through a very similar transition. You'll also hear from Jo Wood, a senior social worker with Care Guidance, and Meagan Thomas, Uniting AgeWell Director of Home Care for Regional Victoria. I want to start by painting a picture of John Hamilton. Born in Griffith, New South Wales, John studied geology and attained his PhD from Sydney University. An incredibly smart man with a strong engineering brain, he worked at the CSIRO in Melbourne. He did extensions to the family home himself and had a passion for repairing old clocks. Lyn and John met in 1955 through singing in the choir of their local Presbyterian church in Sydney, something John continued to do until several years before his dementia diagnosis. Lyn became a social worker, and over the years, they built a loving family, 3 wonderful children, 6 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Lyn, how long have you and John been together?
66 years. We were married in 1958. Fairly young. John was only 2 weeks past his 23rd birthday and I was 18.
Tell me about how you first discovered John had dementia.
It seemed to develop over a long time, and early on it's not something that you really take a lot of notice of. It was just things like drawers being left open and doors not closed. One of the things I did just was little things, but they weren't happening every day and all day. Actually, the thing that really brought it home to me, John's always had to find a great interest as a hobby in, and of course through them we could get his specialty was carriage clocks, things for the shower. He loved them because they were very complicated back in the house. Very good at understanding complicated mechanical things. It was fairly flat. So any clock he had, whether it was his or whether somebody had given it to him to look at, front and back. So there were little things like that, and through them, if there was a part that needed replacing, he would make it to these 2 activity groups. They were 2 different ones. You couldn't find the parts to these. They were old. There was a woman who was working with the 19th century who'd worked in that role. But there was one particular clock that he pulled apart and left on to do with aged care and looking after carers and where you could get support and things like that. And I kept asking about what was happening to the clock, and there was always some excuse. And then one day, our second daughter dropped in to say hello, and we must have been talking about this clock, and she just went looking for a box, packed it in the box, and that was it. So it was her doing it, not me, and John didn't say anything about it. And interestingly, he didn't say much at all about the diagnosis or even how he was feeling about it. It just wasn't something he seemed to want to talk about. So that was the first sign, and then I thought, well, we need to have this checked out. So I made a time to go and see our GP. She referred us to a geriatrician, and that's when we got the diagnosis.
Then the changes really start to happen and you're in a position of caregiving. How did you find that initially?
Well, interestingly enough, our relationship has always been me doing the caring and John just doing whatever he was interested in. He would do things for me if I asked him, but he was so good at whatever he put his hand to. He really was very clever. So I was perfectly happy for him to fix the washing machine, put an addition on the back of the house, put up something in the garden for me if I wanted. But he wasn't. He was quite happy to leave the organising to me. So in a way it was just the same but a bit more of it.
One of the most challenging realities for long-term partners is a significant change in the dynamic of the relationship. There must be an element of grieving for the relationship as it was. How was this experience for you, Lyn?
I'm not sure I thought a lot about it. It was just a sort of a...
Survival.
It was something that had to be done, and that's what I did. And it seemed to be working, and I was determined by this stage that we were going to need to move. So I guess what I did, and when I think about it, it's what I always did, I'd go into planning mode and I'd write lists of what needed to be done. And I think that's what I did in many ways. John belonged to a clock club here in Melbourne, and there was, apart from a couple of friends of ours, there were 2 or 3 fellows in the clock club who were really very supportive and would pick John up and take him to whatever club activities there might have been going on. Interestingly enough, and when I look back I realised it was probably related to where he was at, he got more and more inclined to let me drive rather than him drive. And he never said it to me, but apparently made the comment to the geriatrician that he wasn't happy driving because he thought he might get lost. But at no time did he ever say that to me, or as far as I know, to any of the other family members.
In 2020, Lyn decided to move with John into an independent retirement living community. And as John's health deteriorated further, he moved quite literally next door into the aged care residence.
The diagnosis for the dementia had been made probably about 3 years before. And even prior to that, we had talked a bit about possibly downsizing from our house because it was a largish family-sized home, 4 bedrooms, study, and it was just silly, 2 of us floating around in that. And then when the diagnosis was made, I thought we really do have to do something about it. And under the circumstances, thinking John would probably finish up having to go into care, we needed to find somewhere where they had aged care. And we looked at a few places, and a friend of ours said to me, "Have you looked at Manningtree?" And I said, "No." So we went and had a look, and we finished up buying off the plan because of its location, because it was, there was just everything about it that really attracted us. And so we put a deposit on it and moved in March 2020, 2 weeks before the big lockdown for COVID in Melbourne.
Thank goodness.
Well, I'm glad we got in when we did, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Change is a constant for carers as they navigate the progression of conditions like dementia and constantly face making decisions about what is best for their loved one. For Lyn, the next big decision was about relinquishing the full-time care of her husband, John, probably one of the biggest decisions she would make. When it comes to family and adult children who can see what's happening and that a parent may need support, it can cause tension for them to intervene and to suggest how things should play out. How did you respond when your daughters were suggesting that you may need to make a decision about being able to care for John?
I think in the back of my mind I probably agreed with them, but my first thought was, I can't do this, I've got to look after him. But I got so tired, I realised that I just couldn't keep going. And it's not like me to give up very easily. So in the long run, I said, yes, we'll give it a go.
Most of us don't anticipate having to become a carer for a partner or have the opportunity to plan for it. Often it's when the illness is developing, the reality sets in. What are some of the signs that a family member may need additional support? I asked Jo Wood, Senior Social Worker of the Residential Aged Care Wellbeing Program at Care Guidance, how she sees people falling into that role.
So sometimes it can happen slowly. It kind of creeps up on people without them even realising, particularly if we're talking about older people that might be slowly deteriorating in terms of their physical health over a period of time and their cognitive health as well, particularly if they end up with a diagnosis of dementia. Other times it can happen really suddenly. So we often see people that might have some sudden illness or a fall at home that necessitates a hospital admission, and things can quite quickly change for that person and their carer, who is often the family member that takes on the caring role, and that can be quite traumatic because they're kind of thrown into that role very quickly without any preparation at all.
What are some of the immediate challenges that people face when they start to become a carer?
One thing I hear often from a lot of the carers is navigating the health and social system, navigating those support systems. We often work in a very siloed way, I think, in healthcare. So most people that haven't worked in that area are trying to learn how it all works. Who do they need to speak to? How do they best advocate for their loved one? What information should they be looking for? That's extremely stressful for people, trying to just navigate where to go, where to get information and what support is available. Obviously, the emotional aspects of the whole situation as well, that is huge. The whole change of circumstances for their loved one and for themselves. So all the grief that goes with that. Time management, I think, as well. All of a sudden, people are having to step up and make a lot of phone calls, organise appointments, go with their loved one to appointments. Often, if you're thinking about maybe an adult child who is caring for maybe an older parent, that can be a huge thing. They might be working full time, they might be looking after their own children, and so all of a sudden they're trying to navigate their own family, their work situation and their parents. So extremely stressful trying to do that and fit it all in. So I think those are some of the immediate things that people have to grapple with.
For those new to the aged care system, the role of carer involves a lot of research to find out what services are available. The system can be confusing for people who have never needed to know about what is involved. Let's go back to Lyn when she was living at home and realised she needed more help. Lyn, when you first realised you were going to need more help than you could give John, what did you do?
Well, one of the things I did was, when the diagnosis came through, was actually make contact with our local council to find out what supports were available. And of course, through them we could get hand-holding things for the shower. We only had a couple of steps at the back of the house and one step up into the house at the front. It was fairly flat. But they put in a bar for that as well. Front and back. So there were little things like that, and through them I was able to get a referral to these two activity groups. They were two different ones that John went to, but there was a woman who was working with them who'd worked in that role for a long time, and she just about knew everything about everything to do with aged care and looking after carers and where you could get supports and things like that.
Meagan Thomas is the Director of Home Care Services at Uniting AgeWell. Home care services and respite are often the first step for carers to access support for their loved one and also themselves.
I think it is a big decision for a carer to make. Often people think they can manage, but carer stress levels are rising. I think it's just being, having that willingness to accept that support in home. And I think accessing respite support out of the home is also a difficult decision, having your loved one go somewhere else.
The first thing was,
but I think it's just realising that sometimes you can't do it all on your own and that you do need some help.
And even hearing that is helpful, I think, to know that, to normalise the fact that this is a very normal part of that process of caregiving. You mentioned respite.
Not at him,
so
not at
what are some of the respite options?
Happened.
There are a huge range of respite options for carers. We have something called flexible respite, where a home care worker can go into the home and provide a few hours of care to a client so that the carer can actually take a break. go out or go and do some things that they want to do.
He can't read.
There are some centre-based respite options, so that is obviously outside of the home, but the client can actually go into the centre. There are care workers in attendance that can provide care to that client to give the carer a break. There's also some overnight and weekend respite options through programs like cottage respite, where the client can actually go into the house, and it's a very home-like environment. So they can go into the house for the weekend, enjoy some activities, some outings, where there's care workers and clinical staff to be able to provide good quality care to that client, so the carer can have a weekend out from caring responsibility. And then there's residential respite options. So that means that the person can actually go into a residential aged care facility.
There really is a lot of support out there, and the government plays a big role in subsidising many of these programs. But how can people get more information and start accessing this kind of help?
So through My Aged Care. My Aged Care is the gateway to accessing that support. So you can call them, or they have a website, so people can go in via the web and link in. But there are two sort of programs that we deal with at Uniting AgeWell and in the community, and it's Commonwealth Home Support Program, which really is the entry-level services. So when people don't probably have really high care needs and they might need a little bit of support at home, and it might be simple things such as cleaning or some personal care or even a little bit of nursing or some gardening or something like that. So they will go in and access the Commonwealth Home Support Program. But as their needs increase, they may be eligible for a home care package. And both these programs involve an assessment to determine the suitability for which program. So a home care package is generally for those that have higher care needs. They're various levels. So level 1 is obviously a lower care needs, and level 4 is higher and more complex needs for somebody. So home care packages are really, really tailored to the individual's need, and people work with a case manager to determine what their goals are and what they need in home. And that would be the carer and the client determining together what would work best for them.
As a caregiver, it can be really hard to make that decision or even recognise that you are simply unable to provide the level of care needed, even with all the available assistance that we've talked about.
So given that the transition into residential aged care is such a big step, carers often experience grief as part of that process, grief for the loss of the person transitioning into care, but also uncertainty about what's to come. The Australian Centre for Grief and Bereavement Support can assist with that, along with often social workers that are in facilities and care teams that can provide answers to questions and provide that support as well.
Finally, Meagan, in your 30 years working in this space, is there anything in particular that older people have said they want or need once they're in care that has helped soothe or ease such a big transition?
Yes, I think familiarity is really, really important when people are transitioning into aged care, so it's not such a foreign space for them. Bringing things from home that are familiar, I think that's really important, but also maintaining those social connections, those relationships, and supporting them to do the things that they previously really enjoyed doing. So if that's getting out in the garden, supporting them to get back out in the garden, if that's getting them out for coffee regularly, making sure that happens and making sure that they maintain their social networks, that's really important.
Well, I think we're really fortunate to have found.
So while it can be challenging to go through the process, there are supports out there for carers and the people they look after. How these compounding pressures impact mental health and well-being is another aspect that doesn't get much attention. I asked Jo Wood about some of the more hidden impacts that carers can experience, things we may not even anticipate.
Yeah, I think as people begin that caring role and they're sort of entrenched in it for a while,
in
often people
just my
talk to me
situation,
about
because I wasn't
the
the only
social
one who'd been
isolation
looking
and
after
the loneliness
a
that comes
partner
from caring for
and
a loved one.
ladies' chat group.
Because
and,
so much of their time is
it's just
invested
being
into
part of
that
community
caring role. Often
has
they
really
are
been
losing
great.
their own social connections that normally they would be
Oh,
involved
yes.
with. So friendships, even work. A lot of people have to give up work. I worked with a carer recently who joined one of our carer support groups, amazing woman who has been caring for her mum with dementia
because
for,
those
I
who
think,
are part
about
of there's
5
probably
years.
about 10 of us.
She's
who
in
are
residential
regular,
care in Melbourne, but she
including
relocated
3 or
from
4
Queensland
fellows
and gave
who've
up
been
her
looking after
career to come
wives.
down here and help support
Yes,
her
that's
mum
one of
initially
them.
at home and then
Probably one of the
transition
main
into
things,
residential
but
care.
what we talk about is how we're
she's given up
feeling,
all that she knew
what's
in
happening
Queensland
for
to do
us, what's
that. And a lot of
happening for
isolation
their
comes from
partner,
that.
if they're
The
still
other thing I
alive.
hear from a lot of people
2,
is
3 of them, their partner has
the
since
difficulties
died
with
since
family dynamics
been
that
in the
can
military.
emerge when you're trying to support a loved one
knows and
that's going
understands what
through
the rest of the group are
health
going
challenges
and
or
that's so
cognitive
important.
challenges.
It's so important.
If there's a number of people in the family, people can have different perspectives on what they think is the best thing to do at that time. We're all very different as human beings. We have different ways of navigating challenges, different ways of coping with adversity. And that can bring up a whole lot of strain sometimes in relationships within the family.
I think it's important to find out as much as you can about
maybe hadn't
the illness
anticipated.
that your partner
and I guess not only between family members but also between the carer and the care recipient.
Then understand that you can't
so a change dynamic in that relationship
Whatever
as
you
well
do, you can't
can be
change
something
it.
that people probably maybe
it's
hadn't
one thing for someone
anticipated.
To say a bad heart,
because both of those people are experiencing grief. They're both grieving with the changes they're experiencing in their life. But sometimes they're not quite sure how to communicate between the two of them to best support each other.
Understanding what the outcome may be and accepting
Watching
that
the person you love decline in health is incredibly difficult, particularly if their ability to communicate is also impacted, not being able to explain how they feel or what they want. So what are some of the core needs of ageing adults who are struggling to communicate and connect? Here's Jo Wood.
Even though
definitely, without a doubt, I think it's just this need to feel seen, feel heard, feel understood.
So he hasn't seen me for a week.
Connection, I think.
He saw me yesterday.
This is a time of great
just
loss
doing those sort of little things,
transition and change,
with his meal.
And
because
not
again,
just one loss, but multiple losses that older people are experiencing as they move into residential aged care.
Awful illnesses.
Loss of health, loss of home often. So many people talk to me about the loss of their driver's licence. That is a huge one. Often that comes around the same time or not long before people move in because it kind of equates to autonomy and independence for that person. Loss of relationships, so particularly older spouses that have lived together for 50, 60 years sometimes, and all of a sudden they're having to live in different homes. That's really, really difficult. Loss of community as well. You don't kind of recognise the importance of familiarity and routine within your community. So having your regular GP that often needs to change, your regular hairdresser, maybe you've been going to them for a long, long time. They know you very well. Even just your coffee shop, some people might have been going to. They know the baristas there. They have a chat. Like all of these things make a big difference. So there's huge upheaval for people, and so it's only natural that people are going to be grieving. And so support at that time, I think, is really crucial to help people better adjust to some of the changes that come with that move.
Lyn, perhaps it's your training as a social worker, but your practicality sounds like it's been a wonderful attribute in getting through all of this. But I also imagine there's
involvement
and
with
possibly
family
remains
and
some mental health challenges for you.
Children
Well,
and
I'd say
2
for
great
me,
grandchildren,
the
as well as our 3
initially I was
children.
so tired, I suppose.
There's
I
a
didn't
lot
get
of family
past
to
that.
be involved with.
The thing
But also being part of the Manningtree community.
And not nearly
there is so much happening there that
I
I spend all day and every day
of
doing
putting John into
things,
care.
which
But I
is
get angry
really great. There's no
sometimes.
excuse for doing
Not
nothing.
at him, not at anybody
I
in
love
particular, but
reading,
just
and I always
what's
have.
happened.
So, of course, one of the
Because
groups I belong to
I
is a
keep
book
thinking,
group.
why him?
And we've also got a little
He was
library,
always
so there's
so
books I can borrow
involved
from
in
there,
so many things.
as well as the local
I might
Hawthorn
add with his
Library.
singing, he continued
So there's
to
lots
sing
of
in the major
activities that
choir
I
here
can
in
be
Melbourne for
involved in,
over 30
and
years.
even more.
So
I'm sure
he was
once
involved in a
John's
lot of
not
things.
there
He was
anymore.
clever
But in
with
the
his
meantime,
hands.
I'm determined to
here
keep
he is. He
visiting with
can't-
him,
he
and I
can't
usually
read.
go because
late
he forgets
afternoon
what he's
helping
seen
with
the
his
first
dinner
couple of
at
words.
night, which is great.
Even trying to get
and
a
we watch
sentence
some of
out
the
to
things on the
speak to me or
television.
to one
I
of the
found out
family.
all sorts of things
He can't
about
find the words.
what you can find and what you can't find on
Sort of makes
YouTube.
me feel angry.
Of course, I completely understand. And I wonder, did you do much for yourself at that time, like getting out amongst friends and the community?
Not a lot at that particular time because we were both involved in the local Uniting Church. So I guess I kept up those activities, which involved opening the church a couple of times a week for people to drop in and all that sort of thing. So I didn't really do a lot extra because I had enough on my plate, I felt. The other thing I was determined to do when we were getting ready to move was to not throw anything out if I could pass it on. I've got a bit of a thing about not wasting stuff. And surprisingly, from a house that we'd lived in for 50-odd years, I finished up with a very small container. I was able to get rid of so much else to different places and different groups.
Well, it can be all too easy to push aside our own needs in favour of the person we're caring for. As Jo explains, there are things we can do to stay on top of our wellness and mental health.
I think there are things that I would say for every one of us if we're thinking about the core pillars of mental health and wellness, which I don't think you can underestimate just the importance of things like sleeping well, eating well, hydrating, exercising, fresh air, sunlight, connecting to nature. I think these are things I hear from no matter who I talk to, they're important. I think sometimes they're not given the level of importance that they deserve.
I think if we get those pillars right, because in some ways they seem so simple, we don't really trust that they will have an impact.
Exactly. Sometimes we think that if things sound really complex or even medicalised, sometimes we think they're more important, they're going to do the job. But if we don't have those things in place as a good grounding, I think we can run into problems. And without a doubt, the carers I speak to, particularly in my carer support group that I facilitate, when we talk about strategies that they're employing that they feel are helping them on a daily basis, they come back to those things time and time again. Sometimes they're not aware of the importance of them, but as we talk through it, they actually realise how much of a difference they make to their life day in and day out.
It's interesting, isn't it? All the other transitions that we go through in our lives, you know, from children to teenagers and beyond, we really mark and recognise them and we prepare for them. But we don't talk about this transition nearly enough, do we?
Yeah, life is full of big changes and transitions and just a lot of small changes and transitions that are always happening all the time in our life. And some are really positive, like having a baby obviously is very positive. Some of these other changes, I don't know, we kind of avoid them a little bit, don't we? So we don't really know how to talk about them. And so when we come across difficult topics sometimes, I think as humans we have a tendency to avoid and not want to go there and talk about them, maybe for fear of upsetting that person, just not knowing what to say. But I think even having hard conversations, hard discussions is really important. We can't avoid it, and I think it can help that whole process for both parties in the long run if we're able to do that.
You are incredibly impressive. Sorry, I'm just saying it how it is, Lyn. Mm-hmm. How have you done this? How have you gone through such major upheaval? There's grief in there, there's a change, there's a need for acceptance. Again, your role in the family is a really important one. What do you do to maintain your well-being?
Well, I think we're really fortunate to have found Manningtree because it's a great community. It's not big, it's only got about 49 apartments, but big enough to sort of know people but not be in each other's faces. Such a lot of activities that are going on there. I could do something all day and every day if I wanted to there. And I'm involved in 2 or 3 groups, including a book club and a care group that was started up by one of our members for people in just my situation because I wasn't the only one who'd been looking after a partner, and a ladies' chat group and Yeah, it's just being part of that community has really been great.
And what we hear about this is that connection
Yes.
is vital.
Yeah.
Tell me, in that care group, what are some of the similarities of experience that you share with each other? What are some of the things that come through that you're like, oh, yes?
I think the guilt is a big one, because those who are part of, there's probably about 10 of us who are regular, including 3-4 fellows who've been looking after wives. And yes, that's one of them, probably one of the main things. But what we talk about is how we're feeling, what's happening for us, what's happening for our partner if they're still alive. 2-3 of them, their partner has since died. But each member of that group knows and understands what the rest of the group are going through. And that's so important.
It's so important because it's so unique in a way, but we're all going to be intersecting with it in some way. I'm interested to hear from you as well that common experience is guilt, but it's something that you've worked through. What did you do to find peace with that?
Well, 2 things. First of all, I think it's important to find out as much as you can about the illness that your partner has. And the second thing is, well, in the case of John, is to then understand that you can't change it. Whatever you do, you can't change it. It's one thing for someone to say have a bad heart. You know that there's things can be done for that. I'm not saying it's not that people don't die from something like a heart attack, but getting information as much as possible and understanding what the outcome may be and accepting that you do what you can. I mean, John has either myself or one of our kids go and visit him every afternoon. So he's very fortunate, I'd say, because I know that doesn't happen for all the residents in the aged care facility. But I think that's important, even though I could go in this afternoon and John will respond by saying, oh, you're here. So he hasn't seen me for a week.
Yes.
He saw me yesterday. But, yeah, just doing those sort of little things, and I usually help him with his meal because, again, he's forgotten how to use cutlery, something as simple as that. I have to say dementia is one of the most awful illnesses anybody can have.
Worry and concern for the people we know and love never really ends. So I asked Jo Wood, even once our loved ones are in care, if our role as a carer ever really ends.
So I think the caring role doesn't change, but I think there's certainly maybe more time for the carer to have a little bit of respite from that role. But that's hard in itself. I hear carers say that they feel guilty. They're not there all the time, particularly if they've been in a caring role for such a long time. That becomes a big part of their identity, so they're having to shift how they see themselves as a carer too. I was talking to someone the other day and she was imagining maybe what her life will be like after her husband dies, as he's not very well at the moment. And she was trying to imagine that because she'd been caring for him for, I think, over 10 years, and she was in her late 70s. And so just thinking, well, what will my life be? Who am I now? Sort of all the bigger questions that carers have to grapple with. But yeah, in answer to your question, it certainly doesn't change.
You've been through an incredible journey, Lyn. Now that you and John are settled, what are some of the things you love doing for yourself?
Well, there's involvement with family and with 6 grandchildren and 2 great-grandchildren, as well as our 3 children. There's a lot of family to be involved with, but also being part of the Manningtree community. There is so much happening there that I could spend all day and every day doing things, which is really great. There's no excuse for doing nothing. I love reading, and I always have. So, of course, one of the groups I belong to is a book group, and we've also got a little library, so there's books I can borrow from there, as well as the local Hawthorn Library. So there's lots of activities that I can be involved in, and even more, I'm sure, once John's not there anymore. But in the meantime, I'm determined to keep visiting with him, and I usually go late afternoon and help him with his dinner at night, which is great. And we watch some of the things on the television. I found out all sorts of things about what you can find and what you can't find on YouTube.
You've been listening to The Aging Ideal, a podcast for Uniting AgeWell, produced by Sound Cartel. Subscribe free wherever you listen to podcasts. For a list of really helpful services available to the community, you can head to the show notes of this episode.